Welcome back. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a like. Enjoy the video! The hospital room was illuminated by a cool, sterile light. The hum of machinery served as a constant reminder of Jackie's surroundings and the task ahead. She inhaled deeply, gripping the armrests of the chair in the corner, glowing. A mix of excitement and anxiety surged through her, emotions that had defined the last several months of her life. The moment she had long awaited was finally upon her. "How are you feeling?" David's voice interrupted her thoughts. He stood by the window, tall and composed, though his eyes betrayed the nervous energy beneath the surface. Dressed in his usual business attire, a crisp white shirt, and a navy tie loosened around his neck. Today he was not the hospital COO. Today he was simply her husband, soon-to-be father, and the man who had been her rock through the ups and downs of pregnancy. "I'm okay," Jackie replied, offering a soft smile, though her hands revealed her unease as they rested protectively over her swollen belly. "I just want to get this little one out of me," she said. David laughed as he moved to sit beside her, taking her hand and rubbing slow, reassuring circles on her palm. "We've got this," he said. For a moment, Jackie let herself lean into the warmth of his words, feeling the unity and love that had supported them throughout their journey. They had longed for this child for years, enduring fertility treatments and late-night prayers. Now their baby girl was so close to entering the world. The anticipation weighed on her, but in a good way. As another wave of pressure coursed through her abdomen, Jackie's expression changed slightly. She focused on her breathing, concentrating on the rhythm of her inhale and exhale. "Just another contraction," she murmured, reminding herself to stay calm. David watched carefully, his eyes searching her face for any sign of discomfort. He squeezed her hand, leaning in. "You sure you're okay?" Jackie nodded. "Yeah, just ready. I feel like this pregnancy has lasted forever." David smirked. "You've been saying that since month 6. They shared a light laugh, but beneath their easy banter lay an unspoken agreement that the real challenge was just beginning. This was labor. No amount of preparation or excitement could fully predict how it would unfold. Earlier that morning, when her contractions had begun to regulate, Jackie had instinctively known it was time. The slow, rhythmic tightening in her belly, which had once been sporadic, became steady, like a countdown. The doctor had informed her that this could happen any day now, so after a quick call to the hospital, they packed up and drove in, their hearts racing in sync with the tires on the road. Upon arrival, the maternity wing was calm. Nurses greeted them with practiced smiles, showing them to her private room. Despite the friendliness, Jackie couldn't shake the strange sense of vulnerability that came with being a patient. Even in a hospital her husband practically ran. She settled back in the bed as David paced beside her, looking every bit the anxious father-to-be. "I thought I'd be calmer than this," he admitted, running a hand over his neatly trimmed beard. "I've seen surgeries in this place, but this feels different." "It's because this time it's personal," Jackie replied with a smile, her hand resting on her belly, feeling their daughter's familiar kick. "We've waited for this moment for so long, and now it's here." David leaned down, kissing her forehead gently. "You're the strongest woman I know. You're going to do great." A soft knock on the door interrupted their moment. A woman in her late 40s entered, her blonde hair neatly pinned back, her expression cool and professional. She wore standard-issue scrubs, with a name tag that identified her as Nancy. Her pale blue eyes scanned the room before settling on Jackie. Good morning," Nancy said, her voice pleasant but detached, like someone who had done this hundreds of times before. "I'm your nurse for today. How are we feeling?" Jackie shifted slightly in the bed, already feeling the onset of another contraction. "I'm okay, just starting to feel the contractions getting stronger," she replied, keeping her voice steady. Nancy nodded, barely glancing at Jackie as she jotted something down on her clipboard. "That's normal. First-time moms often think the pain is worse than it is, but don't worry, we'll get you through it." David, still beside Jackie, observed the nurse carefully. Something about her tone felt dismissive, but he held his tongue, not wanting to jump to conclusions. Jackie, however, felt a knot of unease begin to form in her chest. She had heard stories, too many stories, of women, particularly black women, whose pain was dismissed during labor. But that wouldn't happen here. Not in David's hospital. Another contraction hit, stronger this time, and Jackie winced, gripping the sheets. Nancy glanced up from her clipboard, her eyebrows raised slightly but said nothing. Jackie forced herself to breathe through it, but the dull ache in her lower back intensified. "I think I might need to lie down," she said, her voice strained. Nancy clicked her pen and walked over, adjusting the bed's position without much comment. "It's too early for the epidural, but we'll monitor your progress," she explained. An epidural is a type of pain relief given during labor that numbs the lower part of the body, making it easier to manage the pain. "Let me know if anything changes." With that, Nancy left the room, her demeanor professional yet distant. Jackie lay back, staring at the ceiling. The contractions were coming faster now, and despite her efforts to remain calm, she felt a growing unease in her stomach. She wanted to trust the nurses and doctors, but something about Nancy's earlier words gnawed at her. David, noticing the change in Jackie's expression, squeezed her hand again. "Everything okay? Do you want me to call the nurse back?" Jackie shook her head, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. It's just nerves." David nodded, though uncertainty lingered in his eyes. "We're in good hands. Just focus on breathing." Jackie attempted to do just that, concentrating on her breath, on the life growing inside of her, on the joy that was supposed to come, but beneath the surface, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As another contraction hit, one harder and more intense than the last, the knot in her chest tightened. As time passed, Jackie's initial contractions escalated. She shifted uncomfortably on the bed again, trying to find a position that offered relief, but the pain intensified faster than she had anticipated. Each wave of discomfort felt more aggressive, wrapping around her belly and lower back like a vice, squeezing tighter. David remained at her side, holding her hand, but the growing tension in the room was palpable. His reassuring words diminished, replaced by concerned glances toward the door where Nurse Nancy had disappeared after her last check-in. Jackie inhaled deeply through her nose, exhaling slowly as the next contraction hit her like a freight train. This time, she couldn't suppress the gasp that escaped her lips. David leaned in closer. "Are you sure you're okay? You don't look okay." Jackie shook her head, beads of sweat forming on her brow. "It's worse than I expected. Much worse." Her voice trembled, not just from the pain, but from the creeping fear that something wasn't right. David stood up, determination on his face. "I'm getting the nurse." Jackie watched him stride to the door, poking his head into the hallway. Moments later, Nancy re-entered, clipboard in hand, her expression maintaining the same distant professionalism. "Is everything okay?" Nancy asked, her tone lacking warmth or concern. "My wife is in a lot of pain," David said, his voice strained with worry. "She says it's getting much worse. Can we do something for her? Maybe check how far along she is?" Nancy nodded slightly, but an edge appeared in her voice. "It's normal for labor to get more intense as it progresses. She's only been here a short while. First-time mothers often think the pain is worse than it really is." Jackie clenched her jaw. She had experienced real pain before. This was different. Swallowing her frustration, she tried to remain calm. "But could you at least check?" David insisted, his voice firmer now. Nancy sighed, setting down her clipboard and snapping on a pair of gloves. "Fine, let's take a look." She performed the examination quickly, her face revealing little as she checked Jackie's dilation. After a moment, she stepped back, removing her gloves with an air of finality. "You're only about 3 centimeters dilated," Nancy said, her tone clipped. "You've still got a long way to go. This could take hours." "We'll check again in a couple of hours, but right now there's not much we can do except wait. The pain is just part of the process." Jackie's heart sank at the nurse's words. Hours. How was she supposed to handle hours of this if it was already so unbearable? The tightness in her chest returned, the knot of fear and frustration growing with each contraction. "I don't think I can wait that long," Jackie said, her voice barely a whisper. "Something doesn't feel right. This isn't normal." Nancy raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Every labor is different. You're doing fine. Just try to relax." How was she supposed to relax when her body felt like it was being torn apart from the inside? David, sensing Jackie's distress, spoke up again. "Is there anything we can do to help with the pain? Maybe some medication to take the edge off?" Nancy shook her head. barely hiding her impatience. It's too early for an epidural, and we don't want to slow down labor with unnecessary interventions. Let's give it some more time. Jackie felt a lump form in her throat, glancing at David, and seeing the worry etched across his face. This wasn't just normal labor pain. She could feel it deep within her. Something was wrong, but no one seemed to be listening. As time ticked by, the pain escalated to a nearly unbearable level. Jackie gritted her teeth, gripping the sides of the bed as another contraction surged through her body. Her breathing became shallow, her skin damp with sweat. "Jackie, talk to me. What's going on? You look like you're in serious pain," David urged. "I am," Jackie managed to gasp between contractions. "It feels different and so sharp, like something's tearing." David's face paled. He had never seen Jackie like this, and his own fear began to creep in. He glanced toward the door where Nancy had disappeared again. "This isn't right," he muttered. "I'm getting the doctor, Jackie." Jackie could hear him speaking to someone in the distance, his voice tight with frustration. Nancy returned a few moments later, her expression extremely annoyed. "We just spoke about this. I told you it's too early for anything serious. I understand you're uncomfortable, but this is normal." Jackie could barely register the nurse's words. The pain consumed her now, pulling her under like a wave she couldn't escape. She tried to speak, to tell Nancy this wasn't normal, but her voice was drowned out by the sheer intensity of the contraction. David came back into the room, his face grim. "The doctor is in surgery right now," he said softly. "They said he'll be here as soon as possible." Jackie nodded weakly, but her mind raced. What if the doctor didn't make it in time? What if something terrible happened to her or the baby because no one was listening? Time became a blur. Jackie's contractions were now relentless, each crashing over her like a tidal wave. Tears blurred her vision as she clung to David's hand, her body trembling from the pain. "Jackie, talk to me. What's going on?" David pressed, his voice cutting through the haze of pain. "I can't breathe," Jackie gasped. "It feels like something is wrong. I can't do this." David's worry deepened. He glanced toward the door again. "I'm getting someone now." Just as he turned to leave, another nurse entered, her expression attentive. She checked Jackie's monitors, her brow furrowing slightly as she glanced at the readings. "I'm going to call for backup," the new nurse said, her voice calm but firm. "Just hang in there, okay? We're going to take care of you." For the first time, in what felt like hours, Jackie felt a flicker of hope. Someone was finally paying attention. But before the new nurse could leave, Nancy reappeared, a scowl on her face. "What's going on?" Nancy demanded. "I've got this under control." The new nurse hesitated, glancing at the monitors. "Her vitals are dropping. We need to act fast," she said. "Now." Nancy crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "I've been with this patient since she arrived. She's fine. We don't need to overreact just because she's uncomfortable." David's anger boiled over. "Uncomfortable?" he said, his voice shaking with fury. "My wife is in serious pain, and you've been brushing her off this entire time. If you don't get someone in here right now, I'm going to have your job." Nancy opened her mouth to argue, but the new nurse reached for the phone. "I'm calling the doctor," she said firmly. "We're not taking any chances." Quote, dot. As the nurse dialed, Nancy shot David an angry look before storming out. Jackie barely noticed. She was focused on the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears, the dread growing that something terrible was about to happen. Jackie felt like her body was slipping away from her, no longer under her control. Contractions were not just painful, they were brutal. Each one ripped through her with a ferocity that made it hard to breathe, let alone think. David's voice was a low hum in the background, but the words were lost to her now. It was just the pain, relentless and overwhelming, a force too big for her to fight. "David?" Jackie gasped, her voice barely audible. "Something is very wrong." "I know, Jackie, I know. I'm getting help," he replied, his face pale and filled with worry as he leaned closer. Jackie felt her hand go slack in his, fingers cold and trembling. Panic surged through her. She couldn't pass out. She couldn't lose control. She had to stay awake for herself and the baby, but her body felt like it was shutting down piece by piece, and no one seemed to be doing anything to stop it. The new nurse moved with urgency, adjusting the monitors, her eyes flicking to the readings with growing concern. "Her blood pressure's dropping," the nurse muttered, half to herself, half to David. "We need the doctor now." David stood, pacing, his face a mask of helpless fury. "Where the hell is he?" he snapped, his voice shaking. "She's getting worse." Jackie groaned, instinctively clutching her belly as another vicious contraction hit. But this one was different. It wasn't just pain, it was sharper and more urgent, accompanied by a heaviness that pulled at her lower abdomen. Her heart raced as a terrifying thought took root. The baby. Something's happening to the baby. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words emerged. Her vision began to narrow, darkening at the edges. Just as she felt herself slipping, the door burst open. Dr. Sullivan strode in, his face set with determination. He was still wearing his surgical cap, as if he had rushed from the operating room without a word. He assessed the scene, the pale monitors, the panic on David's face, the desperation in Jackie's eyes. He sprang into action, moving to Jackie's side and checking her vitals. "We need to stabilize her," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Get the operating room prepped for an emergency C-section." David stepped forward, fists clenched at his sides. "What's happening? What's wrong?" "She's in distress. The baby's in distress. We don't have time to waste." "She needs surgery now," Dr. Sullivan replied. David's breath caught in his throat. But before he could respond, Nancy re-entered. "I don't think this is necessary," she said tightly. "She's only been here a few hours. This is her first baby. These things take time." Jackie, her head swimming with pain and fear, barely registered Nancy's voice, but David's reaction was immediate. "Are you serious right now?" David's voice was low, trembling with restrained fury. "My wife is lying here on the verge of collapse, and you're still dismissing her pain." "She's not an inconvenience. She's a person, a mother, and you're ignoring her." Nancy flinched at the accusation but stood her ground. "I'm just following standard procedure. She's not progressing quickly enough for surgery." Dr. Sullivan straightened, narrowing his eyes at Nancy. "You should leave this room now." Nancy opened her mouth to protest, but Dr. Sullivan cut her off, his voice colder. "I said leave. You put this patient's life in jeopardy by failing to act when she needed help. If you stay, you'll make things worse. Get out." David stood silent, jaw clenched tight, as Nancy, flushed with embarrassment and anger, stormed out. Dr. Sullivan turned back to Jackie, who was becoming barely conscious, her breathing rapid and shallow. "We're taking her to the operating room now," he said. "Prep the team. We don't have a second to spare, Jackie." Jackie felt herself lifted onto a gurney, cool air rushing over her as they wheeled her out of the room and down the hall. Overhead lights blurred as they moved faster, and she could hear David's footsteps echoing close behind. "Stay with me, babe," David's voice called from beside her. "You're going to be okay. The baby's going to be okay." Jackie tried to squeeze his hand, unsure if her fingers responded. She was exhausted, the pain now a distant throb, muted by the haze descending over her body. But the fear remained, sharp and all-consuming. She was no longer just afraid for herself, she was terrified for the baby. What if they were too late? What if all this time she had been right, and no one had listened until it was too late? As they burst through the operating room doors, the sterile scent of antiseptic hit her, and the bright overhead lights made her squint. The medical team was already assembled, moving with quick precision to prepare for surgery. Dr. Sullivan leaned over her, calm and reassuring despite the chaos. "Jackie, I'm going to take care of you. We're going to deliver your baby right now, okay? Just hang on a little longer." Jackie nodded weakly, unable to speak, grateful for someone who seemed to finally be taking her seriously. As the surgical team prepared for the emergency C-section, David was forced to step back, watching helplessly as his wife was wheeled behind the blue curtain. He stood just outside the operating room, pacing, hands running through his hair as his mind raced. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years managing this hospital, ensuring patients were cared for, that every detail ran smoothly. But now, with Jackie's life hanging in the balance, he felt utterly powerless. A nurse approached him, offering a sympathetic smile. "They're doing everything they can," she said softly. "Dr. Sullivan is one of the best." David nodded, throat tight with emotion. "I just can't believe she was ignored for so long," he said, anger trembling in his voice. "She told them something was wrong, and they didn't listen." The nurse's expression grew somber. "I've seen it happen before," she admitted quietly, "especially with women of color. Sometimes they just don't take them seriously." Nurse Nancy has had issues in the past. She once had a difficult encounter with a black woman years ago. And since then, she's been different. More dismissive, like she doesn't take them seriously. Quote, dot. David's brow furrowed. And what happened? Quote, the nurse swallowed hard. The patient's condition worsened. By the time Nancy finally took her seriously, it was too late to avoid complications. The baby survived, but the mother almost didn't. Instead of reflecting on her behavior, Nancy became more dismissive of black women's concerns. It's like that incident hardened her. She blamed the woman for not cooperating rather than admitting she made a mistake. David felt the blood drain from his face. He had witnessed the consequences of racial bias in healthcare firsthand, but he never imagined it would happen so blatantly in his own hospital, and no one did anything. No one reported her. We tried, the nurse admitted, guilt in her voice. But it's difficult to prove racial bias in healthcare. Nancy's always professional on paper, and her dismissiveness is subtle. Small comments. A shift in attitude when patients are vulnerable and in pain. It's hard for them to fight back, so things just get swept under the rug. David's fists clenched. The nurse seemed to sense his rising fury. I don't agree with it, David. It's wrong. And I've seen it hurt too many women. But I promise the team inside is nothing like Nancy. They're doing everything they can to save Jackie and your baby. Oh. David's chest ached with the weight of it all here. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes briefly to steady himself. She's everything to me, he whispered. They can't let her die. The nurse placed a gentle hand on his arm. She's strong, and she's in good hands. Don't give up hope. Inside the operating room, Jackie felt a strange pressure in her abdomen as the procedure began. But the pain was distant now, dulled by the anesthesia. She was barely aware of what was happening, her mind foggy, thoughts scattered. But then she heard it, the cry, a tiny fragile sound piercing through the haze like a lifeline. Jackie's heart soared, tears spilling down her cheeks. The baby's out, Dr. Sullivan announced, steady and relieved. She's breathing. She's doing great, Jackie sobbed, trembling from the weight of her emotions. Relief, joy, fear. It crashed over her like an overwhelming wave. Baby was okay. She was okay. They had made it. David rushed back in as soon as he was allowed, eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears. He moved to Jackie's side, hands shaking as he brushed his fingers over her face. You did it, he whispered. She's here, and she is beautiful. Quote, dot. Jackie smiled weakly, exhaustion finally catching up to her. Let me see her, she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. A nurse brought the tiny bundle over, carefully placing the baby girl in Jackie's arms. Jackie gazed down at her daughter, heart swelling with a love she had never known before. The baby blinked up at her, wide and curious, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. You're safe, Jackie whispered. We're both safe. Dr. Sullivan ensured Jackie was stable before stepping back, exhaling a long breath as he looked at David, away head. We were close, he said, voice low, but she's going to be fine. They both are. David nodded, eyes still fixed on Jackie and their daughter. Thank you, he said, voice thick with gratitude. Thank you for saving them. Dr. Sullivan gave a small nod, expression serious. I'll be following up on what happened here. This never should have gotten to this point. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. David watched as the doctor left, his words lingering. There would be consequences. There had to be. But for now, all that mattered was that Jackie and their baby were safe. As Jackie lay cradling their daughter, David sat beside her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. You're amazing, he whispered. Both of you. Jackie smiled, eyelids heavy with exhaustion. We did it together, she murmured. David glanced down at the baby, heart full. Yeah, he said softly. We did. Jackie lay in the dim hospital room, body exhausted and fragile, yet filled with deep relief. She cradled her newborn daughter, who was nestled against her chest, breathing softly. The events of the last few hours felt like a blur, a nightmare she was slowly waking from. But here, with her baby in her arms, the reality of what could have happened hit her harder than ever. David sat beside her bed, eyes red and glassy from the intensity of the ordeal. He hadn't left her side since the surgery, and Jackie was grateful for his presence, but an undercurrent of anger simmered beneath his relief. She could feel it in how his hand clenched the arm of his chair, the way his jaw tightened every time he glanced at the door. They had almost lost everything instead. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Jackie murmured, gazing down at their daughter. The baby stirred slightly, tiny fists curling against Jackie's chest. David nodded, but his expression remained tense. "She is," he said softly, "but we shouldn't have had to go through this." Jackie sighed, shifting slightly in bed as a dull ache throbbed through her abdomen. "Now, I know," she whispered. "They didn't listen to me, not until it was almost too late." David's eyes darkened as he stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "Nancy," he muttered, the name spitting from his lips like venom. "She ignored everything you said. She treated you like you didn't matter." Jackie closed her eyes, the weight of it pressing down on her. She had known something was wrong from the start. But every time she tried to voice her concerns, Nancy dismissed her. She wasn't just fighting through labor pain. She had been fighting to be heard. "I don't want to think about her right now," Jackie said softly. "Not while they had their daughter with them." David's pacing slowed, glancing back at Jackie, anger still visible but softened by the sight of their baby. "You're right," he said, exhaling slowly. "But we have to do something, Jackie. We can't just let this go." Jackie nodded. He was right. As much as she wanted to focus on the joy of having their daughter, thoughts of what had transpired and what could have happened gnawed at her. No one should endure what she had just gone through. No one should be dismissed, especially in a place meant to protect their lives. "Later," she said quietly. "We'll deal with it later. For now, let's just be with her." David hesitated, then returned to her side, sitting down and taking her hand. He leaned over, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "You're incredible, you know that?" he whispered. Jackie smiled weakly, but the exhaustion still bore down on her. "We did this together. I couldn't have done it without you," she said. The tension in David's face softened as he looked down at their daughter. "I almost lost both of you," he said, voice barely audible. "I can't shake that feeling." Jackie squeezed his hand. "But you didn't. We're here. We made it." David nodded, but she could see the gears still turning in his mind. This wasn't over for him. Not yet. The moment of peace was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Jackie's heart raced as the door creaked open, revealing Nancy, her face tight with the same cold professionalism she had shown throughout Jackie's labor. "How are we feeling?" Nancy asked, her tone neutral but lacking real warmth or empathy. David stiffened in his chair, gripping Jackie's hand a little tighter. Jackie could sense the tension radiating off him, bracing herself for what was about to unfold. "We're fine," David said coldly, narrowing his eyes at Nancy. "Thanks to Dr. Sullivan, not you." Nancy's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond immediately. "Smalix." She moved toward the monitors, checking Jackie's vitals with practiced indifference. Jackie felt her pulse quickening, frustration rising within her. She wanted to confront Nancy, but the words felt heavy on her tongue. She didn't want to revisit the pain, the fear she felt again. Not yet. But David wasn't holding back. You almost cost my wife and daughter their lives," he said, voice low but filled with barely restrained anger. "Do you realize that? Do you even care?" Nancy straightened, glancing at David briefly before returning to her clipboard. "I was following protocol," she replied flatly. "First-time mothers often don't." "You dare finish that sentence!" David snapped, standing up from his chair. "Don't you dare blame my wife for this. She told you something was wrong, and you ignored her." Jackie winced at the harshness in David's voice, but she couldn't disagree. Every word he spoke rang true. She had been dismissed repeatedly until it was nearly too late. Nancy's eyes flicked toward Jackie, though there was no apology in her gaze. "I did what I thought was best for the situation, too. If you have concerns, you can take them up with the administration." David let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I am the administration," he said coldly. "I'm the COO of this hospital, and trust me, this is far from over." Nancy's expression faltered for the first time, confidence wavering. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, Dr. Sullivan entered, immediately commanding attention. "Is everything all right in here?" he asked, tone calm but firm. "No," David replied tightly. "It's not. This nurse ignored my wife's cries for help. She dismissed her pain, her concerns, and almost killed them both because of it." "Doctor." Sullivan's gaze hardened as he turned to Nancy. "What happened?" he asked, voice low. Nancy's posture stiffened. "I was following standard procedure," she said defensively. There were no immediate signs of distress when she first arrived. "Except for the patient telling you something was wrong," Dr. Sullivan countered coldly. "You're supposed to listen to the patient, not just the machines." Nancy's mouth snapped shut, and for the first time Jackie saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Dr. Sullivan stepped closer to Nancy, expression stern. "Your negligence nearly cost us 2 lives today. We're launching a full investigation into this incident, and you'll be placed on immediate leave pending the outcome." Nancy's face paled. "No excuses. Drive." Sullivan cut her off, voice leaving no room for argument. "Leave now before I call security to escort you out." Nancy stood frozen for a moment, lips parted as if she wanted to argue. But then she closed her mouth, nodded stiffly, and left without another word. As the door clicked shut behind her, the tension in the room lifted, though anger hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Sullivan turned back to Jackie and David, expression softening. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said quietly. "What happened today was unacceptable. Gary, you shouldn't have had to fight to be heard." Jackie nodded, throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, voice cracking. "Thank you for saving us." Dr. Sullivan gave a small, understanding nod. "We'll review all of Nancy's actions today. You have my word that we'll ensure this doesn't happen again. If you need anything at all, just let me know." David, still standing, took a deep breath and nodded. "We'll be following up on that investigation," he said, tone more measured now. "This can't be swept under the rug." "It won't be," Dr. Sullivan promised, voice steady. "We'll get to the bottom of this." With that, the doctor excused himself, leaving Jackie and David alone once more. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of everything that had transpired heavy on their shoulders. Jackie looked down at their baby, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms, blissfully unaware of the chaos that had surrounded her birth. "We did it," Jackie whispered, voice trembling with emotion. "We made it through." David sat beside her, expression softening as he looked at their daughter. "Yeah, we did," he said quietly. But as much as they wanted to focus on the joy of their new family, they both knew the fight wasn't over. Nancy's negligence, her refusal to listen, was a symptom of a much larger problem. And while Jackie and David had survived, others might not be so lucky. "We can't let this happen again," David said softly, hand resting gently on Jackie's shoulder. "Not to anyone else." Jackie nodded, eyes still on their daughter. "We won't. We'll make sure of it," she whispered. 2 days passed since Jackie's emergency surgery, but the weight of the experience still hung in the air. Jackie sat in bed, holding her baby girl as sunlight filtered through the hospital window. She was physically healing, but the emotional wounds, the fear, and the anger remained fresh. David had been by her side the entire time, though his focus had shifted slightly. He had spent the last 48 hours quietly but forcefully demanding answers from the hospital administration. Jackie knew how much this meant to him, not just as her husband, but as hospital COO. He wasn't just fighting for her. He was fighting to change a broken system. That afternoon, David received the call he had been waiting for. The hospital's CEO, along with Dr. Sullivan and the head of HR, wanted to meet with them to discuss the investigation. David's jaw tightened as he hung up the phone, but his eyes held a quiet determination. "They're ready," he said softly, sitting beside Jackie and gently stroking their daughter's head. "They're going to brief us on the investigation results." Jackie nodded, heart rate quickening. This was the moment they had waited for. The moment when everything that had happened would be acknowledged. But it wasn't just about Nancy anymore. It was about ensuring no one else would have to fight for their life the way she had. An hour later, Jackie and David were escorted into the hospital's administrative conference room. It was a stark, formal space. A long table with chairs lined up neatly, and the faint hum of air conditioning. Dr. Sullivan was already there, sitting beside the hospital's CEO, Mr. Thompson, a man David had known for years. There was no small talk, no light-hearted greetings. The atmosphere was tense and serious. "Thank you both for coming," Mr. Thompson began, voice even, though tension was clear. "We want to start by expressing how deeply sorry we are for what happened to Jackie during her labor. We've reviewed the incident in full, and I want to personally assure you that we are taking this very seriously." Jackie's heart raced. She glanced at David, who sat straight-backed and silent, expression unreadable. Dr. Sullivan leaned forward, speaking next. "Jackie, David, the hospital's internal investigation has confirmed what we feared. Nurse Nancy's actions during your labor were negligent. She failed to escalate your condition when necessary, ignored your pain, and made decisions that could have cost both you and your baby's lives." Jackie swallowed hard, grip tightening on David's hand. She had known this. She felt it in every fiber of her being, but hearing it confirmed by the hospital brought a fresh wave of emotion crashing over her. "Nancy has been placed on indefinite suspension," Mr. Thompson continued, voice heavy. "She will no longer be practicing here, and pending the final outcome of our legal review, she may face more serious consequences, including the revocation of her nursing license." David spoke up, voice quiet but firm. "And what about the bigger issue? This isn't just about one nurse. This is about systemic bias. This is about patients, especially black women, not being listened to, not being treated as equals." The CEO nodded slowly, weighing his next words. "We're aware of the broader implications. This isn't just an isolated case, and we know we need to do better. That's why, effective immediately, we're implementing mandatory racial bias training for all staff, as well as a new protocol for responding to patient concerns, particularly regarding pain management during labor. We're also establishing a task force to monitor the effectiveness of these changes and ensure accountability across every department." David's face softened slightly, though the fire in his eyes had not dimmed. "That's a start," he said quietly, "but this can't just be about policies on paper. We need real change." Mr. Thompson nodded again. "I agree. And I'll be counting on you, David, to help lead that change. This is your hospital, too, and you've always been a voice for progress here. We need that voice now more than ever." David exhaled slowly, gaze shifting to Jackie, who had been silent throughout. She squeezed his hand, offering a small nod of encouragement. They had fought this battle together, and while the wounds were still fresh, the acknowledgement of the problem and the steps toward resolution felt like a victory. A few days later, the hospital formally announced Nancy's dismissal. The internal investigation had been swift, and the hospital issued a public statement outlining the steps they were taking to address bias within their institution. The statement was clear and direct. What happened to Jackie was unacceptable, and they were committed to preventing it from happening to anyone else. Jackie read the statement in her hospital bed, emotions swirling, relief, anger, and lingering sadness. Nancy had been fired, but it didn't erase the fear she felt during those critical hours. It didn't undo the trauma of being dismissed when she knew something was wrong. But there was also hope. The hospital was changing. David was already working with the leadership team to overhaul training and protocols for staff, and the issue of racial bias in healthcare was being brought into the open. Jackie knew her voice, her fight, had made a difference. Not just for herself, but for future patients who might face the same discrimination. As she cradled her daughter, Jackie felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had always known the world wasn't perfect, that bias and prejudice existed even where they shouldn't. But now, she had the power to help change that, alongside David and people who truly cared about making a difference. On the morning of their discharge, Jackie and David prepared to leave the hospital with their baby. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room as Jackie dressed their daughter in a soft pink onesie, tiny fingers curling around Jackie's hand. David was quiet, eyes focused on the small bag he packed. But Jackie could feel the emotion radiating from him. He had been strong for her throughout, and as they prepared to leave, the weight of what they had been through started to settle. "Are you okay?" Jackie asked softly, holding their baby close as she sat on the edge of the bed. David looked up, eyes filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "I am now," he said quietly, "but it's hard to shake everything that happened. I keep thinking, what if Dr. Sullivan hadn't made it in time?" Jackie reached out, placing her hand on his arm. "But he did, and we're here. We're leaving this place together as a family." David nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're right, we made it through." As they gathered their things and prepared to walk out of the room, a nurse entered. One of the newer staff members Jackie hadn't met before. She smiled warmly at them, eyes soft as she looked at their baby. "She's beautiful," the nurse said. "Congratulations to both of you." "Thank you," Jackie replied, voice soft but strong. As they walked through the hospital corridors, Jackie reflected on everything that happened. The fear, the fight for her life, and the strength it had taken to be heard. But now, with her daughter in her arms and David by her side, she felt empowered. She had stood up against injustice, and her voice had sparked change. When they reached the hospital entrance, the door slid open, and bright morning light spilled onto the pavement outside. Jackie breathed in fresh air, feeling a sense of freedom and peace she hadn't felt since their arrival. David wrapped his arm around her shoulders as they stepped outside, their baby nestled between them. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly. Jackie smiled, heart fuller than ever. They walked out of the hospital together, leaving behind fear and pain, but carrying with them the strength they had found in each other. They were starting a new chapter, one filled with love, hope, and the knowledge they had made a difference. As they looked down at their daughter, tiny and perfect in her mother's arms, they knew the fight for justice didn't end here. They had taken a stand, and they would continue to fight for a world where every voice was heard, where no one was dismissed, and where love and compassion triumphed over prejudice. Here on Karma's Twists, we share the most impactful stories of karma and justice that the world needs to see. Don't miss a single moment of good triumphing over evil. Join our community and subscribe. Be part of the movement that believes justice always wins.